Let's tank Kil'jaeden in the Tomb of Sargeras on heroic and normal difficulty. Now, this is a three-phase fight with two intermission phases. It's a very long fight, and it's pretty difficult on heroic to say the least. The tank mechanic Fell Claws hits like a truck, and if a soak's missed, then it's pretty much a raid wipe, as the healing requirement, if a soak is missed, is ridiculous, and you pretty much won't survive this without some kind of healing cooldown. And overall, it's a frustrating fight, and it's going to take a while for you guys to get it down. So let's crack on with the guide. So firstly, let's have a look at a few of the mechanics that are going to go on throughout the fight, and then we'll get into each phase step by step, and then go for an overview of the fight. So the main tank ability is called Fell Claws, and what this ability is going to do is empower Kil'jaeden's Claw with Fell energy for 11.5 seconds, causing his melee attacks to increase all physical damage taken by enemies struck by 35% for 20 seconds. This effect stacks. Also on heroic difficulty and above, Fell Claws additionally causes Kil'jaeden's melee attacks to inflict 60% of his melee attack damage to all enemies in a cone in front of him. Now for this ability as tanks, you really need to be aware of it. It does hit really hard, so depending on what class you're playing, you're going to want externals or some kind of big cooldown. And for positioning for this ability, obviously it does a cleave and a big frontal AoE, so you want to be facing him in a set direction so your raid knows where not to stand and where not to go when Fell Claws is actually happening. On the fifth application of Fell Claws, so the fifth stack of it, you want to do a taunt swap instantly so that the tank doesn't take another melee swing who's just got all the debuffs applied to him, as by that time his defensive cooldowns will probably be running out since it is 11.5 seconds worth of damage going out. And then just make sure after the taunt swap that the other tank just moves to the behind the boss or to the side of the boss. As if you're still in front of the boss at this point and another Fell Claws happens to the next tank, you're going to get a sixth stack of the Fell Claws because it doesn't drop off till near the end of the next Fell Claws going out. So just be aware of that. Now there is also in this fight large knockbacks that happen, so if you can work out when Fell Claws goes out on a knockback, and you can put a tank who's got charge, so like a warrior, a druid, monks with transcendence are also good for this. So plan around the other abilities during the fight, because Fell Claws is going to be one of those things that really holds you back on progression during this fight. So be aware of how to handle this. Now, as I just said, there's a knockback, and what this ability is called Rupturing Singularity, which drops a pocket of extra dimensional space onto the ship's deck, which ruptures on impact, inflicting 125 million damage to players at the point of impact, an additional 600k damage to all players and knocking them back. So basically don't stand directly under it and just stand to the side of it, making sure you're not going to get knocked off the ship. Now this can spawn in 5 set locations. There's right in the center of the ship and then the 4 corners. As you'll see on the video, we have markers up. So if it's in the middle, you want to stand in one of the center markers. If you're any further back, you're probably going to get knocked off. And if it's on one of the outer markers, just make sure you're heading towards it and you're at least halfway's worth of ship to get knocked back on heroic mode. And this will start you getting knocked off. Now, I need to be aware for a few things. Obviously, Fell Claws, as I've just gone over. Make sure as a tank and as a player in general, you know where the boss is facing and where the tank's going to be facing him after the knockback, especially if Fell Claws is up. And if you've got a set position where the boss is being tanked and a singularity is going to knock you off, you might want to consider repositioning the boss if you haven't got a charge to get straight back on as the punt is happening. Now, the last ability that happens in pretty much every phase is called Armageddon, and what's going to happen is little swirls are going to spawn around the ship's deck, and there's going to be one big swirl as well. Now, these all need soaking, because if they don't get soaked, a debuff on the whole raid applies called Armageddon Blast, and this just does crazy damage, which will pretty much wipe the raid. Now, for each one that isn't soaked, it's going to stack up. So obviously, if you get one, you may be able to heal through it, but if you get two, you're pretty much going to call a wipe. So make sure that they're all getting soaked, one player in each one. And for the big ones, there's 2 ways you can handle it. You can either have a third tank that just takes each one, or you can use immunity soaks. Now, on this video, I believe we use immunity soaks, but the current strat that we're using is just having a third tank take each one. Now, after you soak one, you're going to get a debuff, so the next set that come out, you want other players to be doing it. Obviously, abilities like immunities don't apply the debuff, so you don't really need to worry about it too much if you immunited one. But if you've got this debuff, you don't really want to be going over 2 stacks, unless obviously it's going to be a wipe, and you're just trying to save the pull because it's close to a kill or something. So just make sure all these are getting soaked. This is pretty much where your majority of phase 1 and 2 wipes are going to be coming from, is the soaking, because people just don't understand that it needs to happen and they need to stop damaging and make sure everyone's getting soaked no matter what. And to know if someone's not in it or not, if they're not standing in the soak, then a little like pillar will spawn from it, a little red pillar, and that means no one's stood in it currently. and that just gives you a visual of what to look for when you're looking around the ship to which ones actually need soaking. Now, if you're really struggling with this, what else you can do is you can set certain players or certain groups to certain corners or quadrants, and that does help a little bit, especially during progression. But obviously, it's one of those player awareness things where they just need to get used to the mechanic. So now we've gone over the 3 basic abilities of the fight. Let's have a look at phase 1. So phase 1's pretty much all about getting your positioning right, where you're going to face the fell claws, how people are going to soak Armageddons, and also getting used to the rupturing singularity pushback. Apart from that, there's only the shadow reflections to worry about, and what these do is 3 players will get a debuff. They need to just stand behind the boss stacked up, and then you're going to nuke the adds down that spawn from them. The longer they're up, the more damage they're going to do and eventually wipe you. So these need to pretty much be prioritized AoE down with as much cleave going on to the boss as possible. That's pretty much all for that mechanic. Just stack them up on the boss, nuke them down, job's done. Now, once the boss hits 80% health, the first intermission phase happens. Now, this intermission phase is pretty much handling rupturing singularities, Armageddon, and then you get a new ability called Focused Dread Flame. And what Focused Dread Flame does is it's going to inflict 6 million fire damage to all players in a line in the direction of the targeted player, divided by the number of players hit. On heroic difficulty and above, a Focused Dread Burst goes off at the location of each player hit by Focused Dread Flame. So basically, you want the person who gets this ability to set a position for everyone, people to go in it, soak it, and make sure they spread 5 yards apart. You want at least 6 players in this just to make sure there's a million hit on each one of these players. Any less and these other players might die from other mechanics going out at the same time. And that's pretty much it for this mechanic. It's not too difficult, you just need to get used to it. The problems come when Dark Singularity goes off and this ability comes straight after it. And if the person isn't set in a good position and everyone's just spread everywhere, people might stack up and they just need to not panic and just make sure you have only so many players doing this ability. And the other mechanic that happens in the intermission phase is called Bursting Dread Flame, and what this does is it's going to mark so many players with the ability. A big circle goes around them and you just want these players to run out the raid and spread out. And these players pop for 1.2 million fire damage. That's pretty much it for the first intermission phase. There's not too much to go on to. Just make sure you're getting the soak so you're getting out with Bursting Dread Flames. And you're not getting knocked off by the Rupturing Singularity and you're doing your Armageddon soaks. Once you get this down, you start phase 2 progression. So in phase 2, you get a lot of abilities stacking up. You now have Bursting Dread Flame, Focused Dread Flame, Fell Claws, Rupturing Singularities, Armageddons, and you have the adds coming back, and you also get a tank ad. So once again, just make sure you're handling the mechanics as I've already explained. Don't panic because there's all these extra mechanics going out. You just handle them all exactly the same. And make sure to prioritize your Armageddon soaks no matter what. Do not let these go off in this phase or it's pretty much a wipe. For the ads, consider using healing cooldowns because that's where most of the raid-wide damage will come in. And for the tank ad, just make sure you have the tank not taking the Fell Claws tank in it and it gets prioritized down ASAP. All the tank ad does, it's going to inflict 1 million shadow damage to enemies within 10 yards and grants a stack of Crescendo. And all Crescendo does is increase its damage by 100%, but we didn't really see this during progression at all. Just focus it down and don't worry too much about it. Now, the tricky part of this phase is to make sure you're going into the next transition phase without any mechanics really going off. Maybe a Dark Singularity can go off, but you don't really want ads to be up because you want pretty much everyone in the raid to be at full health. And the second intermission happens at 40% health. So at about 43%, look for what abilities are coming up. Just make sure you haven't got any ads spawning and try to get your raiders topped up as possible. And tell people to consider using personals for this next transitional phase. So once the boss is at 40%, he's going to cast Deceiver's Veil, and what this is going to do is going to restrict your ability to target any friendly player or enemy more than 8 yards away, causing all spells and abilities to miss and reducing healing done by 100%. Additionally, players are afflicted by Choking Shadows, and Choking Shadows is it's going to absorb increasing amounts of healing the longer you remain in the Deceiver's Veil. So basically, the longer you're in there, the more likely it is you're going to wipe. So just make sure you get this phase down to a T. And to do that, you want to kill all the ads that spawn. Now, these ads spawn at random locations. Pretty much, depending where the boss is, they spawn on his location, but it's still kind of random. So just be aware of that. So if you put the boss in a corner, they're more likely to spawn towards that corner. And if you tempt the boss in the middle, they're pretty much going to spawn all the way around the room. Now, the whole goal of this phase, as I just said, is to kill the ads, but to do that, you need to find where Illidan is. Now, Illidan spawns in a random location. Again, it's slightly to do with where the boss is positioned, but it's kind of hard to explain. You just have to work this out for yourself. I'm sure someone's done like a big write-up on how to actually find him, but the best way we found was to have a druid go feral, track humanoids, and just ping it on the map, and everyone runs to where the ping is. Once you find him, you get a buff off Illidan. And this is called Illidan's Sightless Gaze. And what this does, it's going to grant you a sightless vision, allowing you to see and hit enemies within a 40-yard radius in the darkness. It also allows healers to heal, but also it's going to overwhelm you with fell energy, inflicting 130k fire damage every 1 second for 20 seconds. So the goal is to get this buff once and then kill all these adds. Now, once you've got this buff, you can get DKs to grip the adds together. If you've got a blood DK, you can mass grip. You can get your other Ks to stingle grip, and you can also use typhoons and stuff. Now, these adds do a cast called Destabilize Shadow Soul, and you want to stun this cast because it makes them teleport, and you obviously don't want these adds teleporting around because it makes the phase last longer, and the longer you're in the phase, the more likely it is you're going to wipe. So just make sure as soon as you got the buff off Illidan that you're stunning the adds, gripping them together, and killing them down as soon as possible. Now once all the adds are dead, the next phase and the final phase begins. So in the final phase, we get some of the old abilities back: Bursting Dread Flame, Fell Claws, Focus Dread Flame, and then we get a few new abilities. So the first one's going to be Tear Rift. The next one's Flaming Orb. We get some Demonic Obelisks. And we get Darkness of 1,000 Souls. So as soon as the phase begins, Kil'jaeden will go to the center of the platform, levitate into the middle of the room, and then start to cast a few abilities. The first one he casts is Darkness of 1,000 Souls, and what this does, it's going to fire deadly bolts of shadow at all members of the raid, inflicting 3.6 million shadow damage immediately and 360k shadow damage every 2 seconds for the remainder of the encounter to all players hit. If a player is standing close enough to a rift created by Tear Rift to be affected by Gravity Squeeze, the missiles from Darkness of 1,000 Souls will instead be harmlessly sucked into the rift. So for this first darkness, you want everyone to be stood under the boss, and you want to use some kind of healing cooldown just to negate some of the initial hit of 3.6 million damage. You can use SLTs, stuff like that. And everyone's going to get a 1-stack debuff going into the phase. For every other Darkness of 1,000 Souls that is cast, however, around 2 or 3 seconds before it ends, you're going to want to run into a rift that gets opened up, which will be a semicircle. It's like greenish colour. You just run into it, you stand there till the cast is over, and then you run back out of it. Obviously it's going to do a bit of damage, but not nearly as much damage as everyone getting another stack of this debuff. And that's pretty much all you need to do for this mechanic. It's not too hard. Just make sure if there's no raid cooldowns available, you're all using personals and health pots just to help you get through this. Healers then just need to be healing up the dot that's on everyone. So after the first Darkness of 1,000 Souls have been cast, the boss will immediately cast Tear Rift. And what you need to be aware of with this ability is where it's going to spawn. You kind of want to take the boss close to it, but a bit off center because of the Flaming Orb that's going to be going through it. If you're directly in front of this rift, the Flaming Orb's going to be in your path and hit everyone and do a lot of damage. So just be aware where the Flame Orb is and where the rift is at all times. Now when you're running into the Tear Rift, you're going to be affected by Gravity Squeeze. And what this ability does is it's going to inflict 420,000 shadow damage every 1 second. And this will increase the longer you're in it. So obviously when you need to get in for the next darkness, you want to be going in at 3 seconds like I've already said, and getting out as soon as possible. You can use stuff like movement increases to help you get out, and Druid Roars. This is a good place to use them. Now let's have a look at the Flaming Orb ability. Now this ability is one of those tricky abilities that'll probably wipe you a few times when you hit the phase, but once you get the general grasp of it, it's kind of easy to handle. So the actual Flaming Orb is gonna create a Flaming Orb at a targeted location that follows the player closest to it when it is created. When the Flaming Orb impacts with a player, it triggers a Flaming Detonation. And what Flaming Detonation is, it's going to inflict 2 million damage to all players within 10 yards and creates a pool of fire that afflicts any players who enter with burning. The size of the pool of fire created is reduced based on the length of time it takes the Flaming Orb to trigger a Flaming Detonation. And what burning does, it's going to inflict 950k fire damage every 2 seconds for that you're in the patch. So what you're going to have to do for this ability is assign someone to stand near it when it's spawning, kite it around, and then proc it. Mages are really good at this, and Feral Druids, because they can go into bear form. Mages can ice block when they need to proc, and then get out of the big flaming patch. You want to kite it for about 5 seconds, I'd say, just to get it into a decent position to proc. Put it in a position where it's not going to go through the raid, so in the centre of the room, for example, is a really bad spot, or where the boss is being tanked is also another bad spot. Now, for us as tanks, you need to be aware of where this Flame Orb's spawning. If you've got a lot of melee in your group, it's most likely going to spawn in melee, so you're going to be wanting to move the boss if it's going to spawn there, so that no one's standing near it when it's going to proc. The worst thing that can happen is you don't move the boss and then it goes onto a tank and it blows up, and that's pretty much a raid wipe. Once it finally does get procced, it's going to get sucked into the rift, so obviously don't be between the big circle on the ground and the rift, or it's going to go straight through you as well. Now, the last thing I'm going to go over about this phase is the demonic obelisks, and what these are is the boss is going to create demonic obelisks positioning around the platform, which detonate in a cross of fell energy after a short time, inflicting 2.5 million fire damage to all affected players and knocking them back. So how these obelisks work is they'll spawn. The longer the phase goes on, the more that spawn. I believe it starts at 2 or 3, and then it goes 4, then 5, then 6, so on and so forth. However long the fight lasts, you get more and more, and they're going to make the room smaller and smaller for spaces that are safe. These pretty much will put you about a quarter of the platform off, so if you're near the side, you get hit by one, you're most likely going to go off. You can charge back on or heroic leap back on if that does happen, but obviously try to get in a safe zone. Now, the way the beams work that come out of them is they go with the platform lines, so they'll shoot one north, one south, one east, one west all the time. They never go at angles, so just also be wary of that. Play it kind of like Bomberman bombs work. If you've ever played Bomberman, that's the best way to describe it. Otherwise, see it for yourself and just get used to how they shoot. And that's the other thing that'll probably most likely wipe you. Now, obviously, with all this movement, like I've said, you've got to move for the rifts, you've got to move for the obelisks. You need to be very wary of this movement when Fell Claws is out, because you don't want to be cleaving your aid at all during this fight. So if you do have to do any erratic movements with the boss, which you shouldn't really have to do too much, unless the phase is lasting way too long, then just call it out if you do need to drastically need to move the boss, just so people know they may need to move for the cleave or Fell Claws. And once again, because of the initial that darkness of 1,000 souls is going to put on you, you're going to be taking a little bit more damage as the tank when Fell Claws is up, so just be ready to call for external cooldowns and kind of plan out your cooldowns for the Fell Claws in the last phase, because they do get very tricky and there is a hell of a lot of tank damage going out. And that's pretty much it for my guide. There's not too much really to go over. You can either bloodlust in the last phase or the second phase. It depends how your guild wants to do it. Obviously, whatever you need to do to make some timers. And apart from that, the fight's pretty much done with once you get all these mechanics down. Now, this is a very long guide for me. I normally try to keep it to 5 to 10 minutes, but there's just so much to go over. There's like 5-6 phases in this fight, so it's taking me a lot longer to explain everything. But anyway, thanks for watching if you've got to this point. Thanks for the support, and I'll see you guys in my Mythic guides that should be coming out in the next few weeks.